Donald Trump has survived almost everything modern American politics could throw at him: impeachments, FBI raids, civil judgments, election investigations, damaging recordings, former allies turning against him on national television. Every scandal arrived like a hurricane and somehow left behind the same image, still standing at the center of the storm, louder than before, angrier than before, politically alive when most careers would have already collapsed under the weight of the damage. But there is one thing: even the most disciplined political machine struggles to survive once it enters a courtroom: a tape. Because once jurors hear your own voice, the argument changes. Suddenly, this is no longer about media spin or campaign talking points or who won the cable news cycle that night. A recording does not care about polling. Surveillance footage does not care about loyalty. And federal prosecutors understand something most politicians fear more than headlines. People can rationalize accusations, but they struggle to rationalize hearing someone allegedly incriminate themselves in real time. That is why what happened inside that Florida courtroom today felt different from every other Trump legal spectacle Americans have watched over the last several years. The marble floors were packed with reporters before sunrise. Federal prosecutors walked in carrying binders thick enough to look like bricks. Trump himself did not appear in court, but his co-defendants did, including longtime personal aide Walt Nauta, standing beside attorneys while prosecutors laid out an updated indictment that now pushes the total number of felony counts against Donald Trump to 40. 40 federal charges surrounding classified documents stored at Mar-a-Lago, obstruction allegations, conspiracy accusations, and now something potentially even more politically toxic: claims that Trump and members of his inner circle attempted to destroy surveillance evidence after federal subpoenas demanded preservation of records. Then prosecutors played the tape. Not a dramatized reconstruction, not leaked anonymous testimony, an actual recording tied directly to the federal investigation. The courtroom heard Donald Trump discussing classified material while allegedly acknowledging its sensitivity out loud. Then came the line prosecutors wanted everybody in that room to hear clearly. Look, this was him. This was the Defense Department. Not a joke, not sarcasm, not political theater at a rally surrounded by cheering supporters. A private conversation now sitting inside a criminal case involving classified national security documents. And according to prosecutors, that was only the beginning. Because the real shockwave inside the courtroom was not simply about possession of documents anymore, prosecutors are now constructing a far more dangerous narrative around obstruction. They allege that after subpoenas were issued demanding security footage and preservation of evidence, Trump and associates attempted to erase camera recordings before investigators could obtain them. Think about the timeline carefully, because the timing is the entire story here. Federal subpoenas arrive demanding records be preserved. Hours later, according to the prosecution, conversations begin about deleting surveillance footage and wiping servers. That distinction matters enormously. A former president arguing he accidentally kept documents is politically survivable. A former president allegedly trying to destroy evidence after receiving subpoenas becomes something else entirely. And maybe the most revealing moment came after the recording ended. Nobody moved. No dramatic objections from the defense team. No immediate outrage. No eruption inside the courtroom. Just silence hanging in the air, long enough to make even veteran reporters uncomfortable. The kind of silence people fall into when they realize a case they thought was complicated may suddenly become very simple. Because this stopped sounding like a paperwork dispute. It started sounding like panic. And panic is exactly what federal prosecutors now appear determined to prove. Not confusion, not miscommunication between lawyers and staff. Panic. The kind that happens when someone suddenly realizes the evidence sitting inside a server room may become more dangerous than the original accusation itself. That is why the updated indictment matters so much more than many people realize. Prosecutors are no longer presenting Donald Trump as a careless former president surrounded by disorganized boxes at Mar-a-Lago. They are painting a picture of deliberate concealment after the federal government had already come knocking at the door. The receipts are brutal when you line them up chronologically. In May of 2022, a federal grand jury subpoena demanded the return of classified documents still being held at Mar-a-Lago. Investigators specifically ordered preservation of surveillance footage covering storage areas inside the property. According to the superseding indictment filed later, prosecutors allege that shortly after those demands arrived, conversations began involving the deletion of security camera footage. Not months later, not before the subpoena, after it. That timing changes the psychological temperature of the entire case. Because ordinary Americans understand instinctively what it usually means when somebody suddenly wants cameras erased after investigators request them. If a casino owner wipes surveillance footage after federal agents issue subpoenas, nobody shrugs and calls it politics. If a corporate executive orders hard drives destroyed during an SEC investigation, shareholders don't call it a witch hunt. They call their lawyers. They prepare for indictments. Yet somehow, in this case, the country has spent years arguing over whether the rules should function differently because the defendant used to live inside the White House. And prosecutors know exactly how to weaponize that contradiction in front of a jury. That is why Walt Nauta matters. Trump's longtime aide is no longer just a background figure carrying boxes through hallways at Mar-a-Lago. According to federal filings, Nauta allegedly moved boxes of classified documents before attorneys conducting searches could review them. Prosecutors say surveillance footage captured movements of containers in and out of storage rooms while Trump's legal team was preparing responses to federal investigators. Now add the alleged discussions about deleting security footage itself, and suddenly the narrative prosecutors are building becomes much darker than simple retention of documents. It starts sounding coordinated, and the prosecution appears obsessed with proving intent because intent is where obstruction cases become lethal politically and legally. Donald Trump continues insisting he did nothing wrong. His allies still describe the investigation as politically motivated. But notice what keeps happening every time new evidence surfaces. The public defense shifts. First, the argument was he declassified everything. Then it became presidents can keep records. Then it became the FBI overreached. Now prosecutors are introducing evidence that allegedly shows efforts to destroy surveillance footage after preservation demands were issued. Every new layer forces the defense further backward. That matters because juries notice retreat. They notice when explanations evolve faster than evidence disappears. And here is the part many commentators still underestimate. This case is not emotionally driven by classified documents anymore. Most Americans will never read those files. They will never understand nuclear protocols or military contingency plans or intelligence classifications. But they do understand cameras. They understand deleted footage. They understand wiping servers after subpoenas arrive. Those are not abstract legal concepts. Those are actions people associate with guilt in everyday life, which is exactly why the atmosphere inside that courtroom reportedly changed the moment prosecutors focused less on what Donald Trump kept and more on what prosecutors say he tried to erase. And that shift may explain why the pressure around Donald Trump suddenly feels different even inside his own inner circle. Because obstruction cases do something political scandals usually fail to do. They force loyal people into timelines, dates, phone calls, server logs, security footage, visitor records, digital trails that cannot simply be shouted away at rallies or buried underneath campaign speeches about persecution. Once investigators start reconstructing sequences, minute by minute, loyalty stops functioning like protection and starts functioning like exposure. That is where Susie Wiles enters this story, and her role may become far more dangerous for Trump than many Republicans are willing to admit publicly. Susie Wiles is not a random campaign volunteer or disposable staffer. She is one of the most trusted operatives Donald Trump has left, a longtime strategist, the woman credited with stabilizing his political operation, the person many insiders describe as disciplined enough to survive inside a political orbit, famous for chaos and infighting. Trump trusts her because she rarely becomes the story herself. Now she may become impossible to separate from it. According to newly discussed filings and reporting tied to the investigation, prosecutors are examining incidents where highly sensitive materials were allegedly shown or discussed in the presence of people who were never supposed to have access to them. One allegation centers around a classified military map reportedly displayed aboard Trump's private plane, a document prosecutors describe as extraordinarily restricted, not the kind of paper someone casually waves around like a campaign flyer at a fundraiser. The kind of material that exists precisely because governments assume certain information is too dangerous to circulate freely. And here is where the narrative begins tightening like a vice, because prosecutors are not treating the classified documents case and the alleged obstruction effort as separate universes anymore. They are increasingly building connective tissue between them. The server's prosecutors say Trump allies discussed wiping reportedly contained surveillance records, movement logs, communications, and potentially digital evidence tied to who accessed what inside Mar-a-Lago. Then another explosive layer enters the picture. Epstein-related material and flight records that have continued haunting Trump politically, even without direct criminal charges against him in that separate matter. Now imagine how prosecutors could frame this sequence to a jury. Federal subpoenas arrive demanding preservation of evidence. Conversations allegedly begin about deleting surveillance footage. Servers become a focus. At the same time, individuals inside Trump's own orbit reportedly already know sensitive material exists connecting multiple controversies surrounding Mar-a-Lago, classified documents, and Epstein-related scrutiny. Suddenly, the alleged deletion effort no longer looks isolated. Prosecutors can present it as an attempt to contain an expanding fire before investigators reach the fuel underneath. That is the real danger for Donald Trump right now. Not one isolated scandal. Convergence. Because politically, Trump has always survived by compartmentalizing crises. One controversy replaces another before the previous one fully settles into public memory. But convergence destroys that strategy. Once separate investigations begin emotionally merging in the minds of voters and potentially jurors, the story changes from another accusation into a pattern of behavior. And patterns are devastating in courtrooms, especially when the central accusation becomes simple enough for ordinary people to understand without legal expertise. Prosecutors do not need jurors memorizing classification codes or intelligence protocols. They only need them asking one deeply human question. Why would someone allegedly try to erase cameras and servers immediately after receiving subpoenas if they believed nothing damaging existed? That question hangs over every development in this case now. Not because cable news says so, because the timeline itself says so. And maybe the most politically toxic detail of all is this. The people closest to Donald Trump increasingly look less like a shield around him and more like witnesses standing one subpoena away from becoming part of the evidence. And that is the moment this story stops being about Donald Trump alone and starts becoming something far more uncomfortable for the entire country. Because every legal system eventually reaches a pressure point where citizens begin asking whether rules are real or merely decorative, whether subpoenas carry actual authority or function like polite suggestions for powerful people, whether surveillance evidence matters equally when the defendant once controlled the executive branch of the United States. That is the moral center of this case, and it is why the atmosphere around this trial feels heavier than ordinary partisan warfare. An average government employee caught removing classified files from a secure facility would likely lose clearance immediately, lose employment immediately, and potentially spend years fighting federal charges without millions of dollars in campaign donations cushioning the fall. An ordinary maintenance worker accused of deleting surveillance footage after receiving preservation orders would probably never appear on television claiming victimhood. They would appear in handcuffs, entering a federal courthouse through a side door while nobody outside even learned their name. But when the person accused is Donald Trump, the entire country pauses and argues over whether accountability itself has become political. That contrast is impossible to ignore now, because look carefully at what prosecutors are allegedly presenting. A former president who spent years branding himself as the embodiment of law and order is now fighting allegations that he retained classified national security documents, discussed sensitive materials openly, moved boxes during an active investigation, and then allegedly attempted to erase surveillance evidence after subpoenas demanded preservation. Not before the government arrived, after it. That sequence matters morally because it transforms the image from defiance into concealment. And the silence inside that courtroom may ultimately become the defining symbol of this entire chapter. Not the headlines, not the campaign statements, not the fundraising emails claiming persecution, the silence. 45 seconds where nobody interrupted the tape. 45 seconds where no legal slogan could overpower a timestamp. 45 seconds where the machinery of political spin collided headfirst with something much colder than ideology. Recorded evidence. Because for years, Donald Trump survived by keeping every crisis moving faster than public attention could process it. Attack the investigators, attack the judges, attack the media, flood the information space until exhaustion replaces clarity. But courtroom evidence does not get tired. Server logs do not become emotional. Surveillance footage does not panic under cross-examination. And prosecutors appear increasingly determined to reduce this entire sprawling political saga into one devastatingly simple question ordinary Americans can understand immediately. If someone truly believed they were innocent, why allegedly try so hard to erase what the cameras captured? That question now hangs over Mar-a-Lago, like smoke over a crime scene. And maybe that is why this moment feels historically dangerous for Donald Trump in a way previous scandals did not. Because this case is no longer fueled primarily by ideology. It is being driven by chronology. Dates, recordings, preservation orders, movement of boxes, alleged deletion efforts, witnesses inside the inner circle, evidence stacking on top of evidence until the story stops feeling chaotic and starts feeling frighteningly coherent. So now the country waits, not just for verdicts or headlines or election polling. The country is waiting to see whether the American legal system still possesses the ability to apply pressure upward instead of only downward, whether federal law remains law once it reaches the doorstep of extraordinary power, whether accountability survives contact with celebrity, money, influence, and political fear. And that may be the real reason the courtroom fell silent. Because deep down, everybody in that room understood they were no longer simply watching another Trump controversy. They were watching a test of the system itself. If you believe stories like this deserve calm, fact-driven analysis instead of noise and propaganda, make sure you like this video, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Because this story is far from over, and the next chapter may become even more explosive than what America witnessed today.